Good morning, y'all. Okay, last week we dug in on this story, very well-known story from Luke chapter 15. I've given you a copy of it in the easy-to-read version. I like the simplicity of the language, and I trust the hard work that the translators, originally from World Bible Translation Center, now Bible League, do on this particular translation. I think it's helpful. I encourage you to read it in other versions as well. There's things that'll pop out as you look at different versions. There's some interesting things that happen in this story. Last week, we recognized there might be an older son, younger son theme here that we pick up on in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. There's probably some connections there. There's things to notice in this story that help us process what our relationship to God and what our relationship to each other is supposed to look like. We dug in on a bunch of this last week, recognizing that maybe some of the simple ways that we've read this in the past, while still valid, miss some deeper points. And so I want to encourage us to dig in deeply. So I'm not going to do a full review, but I introduced these key phrases last time. They're on the back at the bottom: father, brother, son. And I encouraged us to think about, in addition to, as part of those three, what it is in this story when someone is unfathering the father, or unsonning themselves, or unbrothering themselves. That's happening here, and it's an important part of this story. We talked about, or I want us to think about home, about exile. You know, somebody leaves home, somebody is in exile, somebody comes back to home, somebody's at home but not at home. Those ideas in the story. But what it means to be in or out of a social structure, social group. What is mine or yours? This language happens in regard to possessions in this story. And then overall, the big idea that we're wrestling with in the whole story is the idea of who do we exclude and who do we embrace. And excluding, we can't just have a simple, 1970s Coke commercial and say, well, we don't exclude anybody, we embrace everybody. That's wonderful. It's great to think like that, but the reality is that's not the way life works. And there is excluding and embracing in our lives. Some of it, sometimes we exclude appropriately and embrace appropriately, and sometimes we do both inappropriately. We exclude when we should be embracing, or we embrace when we should be excluding. And so that all of that comes into the conversation. So I want us to read this story one more time. And I'm going to add one more question. And we talked about it a little bit last week, but I want you to think about it again. Who is the protagonist? Who is the one that's making the story move ahead? You probably already thought of it in your head, but watch for it in the reading. Who is causing the story to move forward? Who has the goal? Who's facing an obstacle? What is the obstacle to the goal? What's going on in the story? Because who you place as the protagonist definitely impacts how you read the story. Okay? Now, can I get a volunteer to read it? It's the easy to read version. All right.
And he said,
You are. That's it.
and he said, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of my property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them.
All right, Ronnie, I'm gonna ask you to go just a little louder, please, because I am trying to record this.
You start over?
No, that's fine.
Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. Now the older son was in the field, and he came and drew near to the house. He heard music and dancing, and he called one of his servants and asked, What does these things mean?" And he said to him, "Your brother has come. Your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him back safe and sound." But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It is fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead, and he is alive. He was lost, and he is found." My story punches a hole in me.
I deeply desire to encourage you to not decide you understand this story in one reading, and even in the hundreds of readings you've done, and to spend some time with it. I do not want to come in here and teach a class where I give you the answer to the proper interpretation of this story. I really want to encourage you to spend time sitting in this story. Okay. That said, I do want to ask some questions. I want to explore some ideas. So let's begin with who's the protagonist, but I want you to answer that in terms of what is the protagonist's goal? What is blocking the protagonist's goal? What's the obstacle the protagonist is trying to overcome towards the goal? And where do you see those happening? I want you to point them out to me. I want you to talk about them in the story. So you willing to do that? Go for it.
Me, the protagonist, I think, is the father.
Okay.
And his goal is having good sons. You know, it seems like to me that's what it is. And the obstacle of that is his son and his pride and his foolishness to run off and take everything and run off and drink and chase women and whatever. To me, that's the. But I think, of course, in the end, the big picture is that this son came back. He found his way back. And I think also that there's a part of it that says the son humbled himself. With humility, he realized, I messed this up big time. And he was humbled himself enough to say, I messed this up, and I want to go home.
Okay, so and that's fine. I don't disagree. The son definitely humbles himself, but if he's not the protagonist, if the father's the protagonist, that's less important in the story than what's going on with the father. So I'm going to stay with, can we all agree the father's the protagonist of the story?
No,
No.
No.
Go ahead.
I want to make a case for it being the younger son,
Okay.
because his goal is to become an independent person of himself. And the story is of his becoming that. He has to, it's a coming of age story to me. He has to find out that his version of becoming an independent full self is not what he thought.
Okay. All right. I don't want to cut you off. Are you
That
done?
was done.
Okay. This is so important that she said this, and I'm going to explain why. I disagree. I think the father's the protagonist, but I absolutely think it is vital that we read the story with the son as the protagonist and ask ourselves, number one, why would we read it that way? And number two, what does it do to the story? How does it change the story? And I want to say this, number one, the reason we would read it that way is because that's the American dream. We are all about independence. And so we immediately read every story with ourselves at the center of the story. Are you with me, church? Hang on. I think that's really important. And if we do that, it does change what the story's about. The story then is about, as I read, one rabbi, or not even, he's not even a rabbi, he's just a Jewish studies guy, say, this is the point of the story is that God allows for repentance and allows us to come back. That's the point of the story. It's about, okay, you might be Jewish and you might quit being Jewish, but you can always come back to being Jewish. And Jesus is encouraging all those Greek Jews who've stopped being Jewish to come back and live the ways of the Father. That's the point. Jesus is trying to get Jews of his day to understand they can't keep acting like they're Romans or Greeks. They need to start acting like they're Jews again. That's the point of the story. So hold on, because I got two more people who want to jump in. I'm just saying you got to wrestle with that because that is real. If we center the son, we do create implications for what the story means that may actually be good things. Don't get me wrong. It's great for Jesus to encourage Jews to stop going to Roman baths, okay? If that's what Jesus is doing, but it does change the point of the story. Keep your idea, don't lose it, but I want to let Grace go next because she was raising her hand before I even talked, and then Jim's got something.
I think it is about the father, and what I get from it is the father who wants to have relationship with his sons. And the younger son knew to come back to the father, but the older son missed the whole point of the benefit of being with the father all those years.
All right, so what Grace just did is shift. Ronnie said the goal is to raise good sons. Grace is shifting it and saying if the father's the protagonist, the goal is to have relationship with his sons. I'm going to go ahead and push us a little bit on that. He doesn't just want relationship between himself. I'm pointing to a triad, father, older son, younger son, I have drawn on the board. And I have arrows. You have relationship between the father and the younger son. You have relationship between the father and the older son. But in this story, you also have relationship descriptions about relationship between the sons. Brother is a relational term in the story. And so there is, if I'm pushing it, he doesn't just want relationship with his sons. He wants his sons to have relationship with each other. And he wants them to live in family. So his goal, I'm saying, is to have family. And family that will continue even after he dies. That's the father's goal. That's, now, I'm reading it that way. I'm reading that into it. That means certain things in the story. Jim, and then we'll go back to Carol, who'll get to fight for the younger son.
I think if we add 2 verses to what we've read, we can put yes, the entire chapter into the context that brought Jesus to tell this parable. And those two verses are the first two that end. Some people are listening to Jesus and I don't like what he's doing. He receives sinners and eats with them. And without any further introduction, Jesus tells a parable. And I think that perhaps if we're seeking one singular outstanding rationale for this chapter, for this parable, we're doing it a disservice. There's multiple ones, and that makes it even richer. So I would vote for expanding the reading 2 verses and looking for multiple understandings.
I think that's great, Jim, and I would encourage reading the whole chapter. In fact, I think the 2 parables that precede this one, in fact, have the same message. But absolutely, this is about the justification for Jesus eating with and welcoming sinners. That is the motivation of the story. So I think, Jim, what you're actually arguing for there is that there is a single driving goal of these 3 stories, and that is relationship is the goal. Back to Carol.
Well, I think Jim makes a great point, because that does shift it. We've been just talking about this so long, we've forgotten all that, and the 2 parables ahead of it. Obviously, this triad does do that. So it would have to be the Father, because it's about relationship with the Father in different things.
And it's interesting that what he does with the parables is he starts with a shepherd who has a relationship with his sheep. But notice that what he goes for, the celebration is celebration with friends. And then he goes to a woman, and he makes it an inanimate object, a coin. But what does it go to? It goes to celebration with friends. And so the goal is this gathering of people in relationship that's significant. Rachel.
I have a quick question. So growing up, I always saw the Father as God. But one time you said the Father in this story is not God. And I can't remember who you said the Father in this story is.
Oh, okay. I didn't.
Can we go
If
back?
I may have said it exactly like that, where I said the Father is not God. But what I meant to say, if I said it that way, is in the story, the Father is a father. You need to read it as father-son relationship. That's what the story is presenting. Now, what a parable means is Jesus takes an everyday occurrence and he lays it beside a spiritual truth. And he allows humans who can't really get the spiritual truth to get it because they compare it to a physical truth that we experience, a life experience, right?
Without it being an exact metaphor.
It is not an exact metaphor.
That's why
Ever
you
is
said
it an exact metaphor. And so, and one reason, I'll just give you an example of why that's important as you read this parable. In reality, this parable has the father staying home. But the shepherd parable has the father pursuing the lost sheep. So the parables have different purposes. That's why there's 3 of them. So the truth that we learn about God first is God seeks after the lost ones. But then what Jesus does with the final parable is say, but we know life gets really messy, and when relationship, the goal of the Father to have relationship, familial relationship is obstructed, there has to be stuff done to repair it. It's not a simple process. And we don't read this story deeply enough to catch all the cues in this very abbreviated story of all the work that is done to recreate and reestablish the Father's goal. And it's important. And you'll remember that last week I said I was really bothered by the Africans not getting this story. I wanted them to just get it. But what I wanted them to get was what Carol was talking about. We really do want to put ourselves in this story. And what we do when we tell it is we want to put our kids in the story and say, you're going to be the prodigal son someday. And I want you, when you're the prodigal son, I want you to come home. That's what we do with this story. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I wanted the Africans to do with it. The Africans, no, this is completely wrong. The father has no business welcoming this son. This is complete, because they get the father's goal. The father's goal is to hold his family together and to continue this family generational after generation. And so they're like, no, if you do this, it's going to destroy. There will be no lasting generations of family. We have people in our villages who do this, and it disrupts society. We don't want this going on. They can't get past the father's initial goal. So it wasn't until I read Miroslav Volf talking about this parable that I began to understand where now I want to go back to Uganda and teach this all over again. I want to have actually, I want to go back to Uganda and let them teach it to me this time. I've had several, Carol, please forgive me, but I'm going to go to Rick first because he's been popping up.
I want to get back to the relationships. Both sons take for granted the relationship with the father. The one goes into exile, leaves father. The one that's there has father with him all the time, takes it for granted, and don't really see that he's that important, and that he's there with the father. Till the other son gets where and I gotta go back. This is terrible. But he knew he could go back.
Yeah, I'm going to go so far as to say that the older son exiles himself. And I want us to see. In fact, let me just run us through. What are we doing time-wise? Somebody. We're out of time. So let me just run through. If you have a pen and you want to, make a note, let me just run through the paragraph. First paragraph, verses 11 through 12. I think we have an embrace paragraph here, right? And the beginning of the exclusion, but it is still embraced. The son asks for the property to be divided, but the son has not left. The son is still a son in that paragraph. The embrace still exists. The next paragraph is when the son leaves and the exclusion begins. Then at verse 17, that paragraph, we continue this exclusion. He comes to himself. He recognizes, I'm no longer qualified to be a son. So he desires to have food in his belly, but at the exclusion of being part of the family, at the exclusion of the father's goal. He's still working against the father's goal. I'm going to go home, but I'm going to go home as a hired man. That's still an obstacle to the father's goal. And then the next one, while he's still a long ways off, the father sees him and embraces him. That paragraph is an embrace paragraph. The son tries to repair the relationship by confessing his sin. But before he can move to the exclusion clause, he says, I'm no longer worthy. I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Stop. We're not going to the exclusion phase, the father says. No. We're not going to do the hired hands idea. We're going to come up with a once dead son is now alive, a once lost son is now found. Now, where Miroslav Volz helped me is that does not mean he is restored to full sonship the way it was before he left. It's a new son relationship.
Yeah.
It's a different son. There's no promise of another inheritance, another piece of the inheritance. There's no promise of receiving a special blessing. There's no establishing him and the other brother as equal in status. None of that occurs. The father simply says, a dead son is now alive and the lost son is now found. That's all he said. But he will not take him back as a hired hand. It has to be as a son. Because the father's goal is to have a family. All right?
And in the process, he may have lost the other son.
Absolutely, he may have. And if he had accepted the first son back as a hired hand, he may have kept the first son. The first son, if he had said, well, okay, I see you learned your lesson. Sure, get on out in the barn. Your older brother be out to tell you what to work on first thing tomorrow morning. The older brother probably would have welcomed him back. I mean, we're speculating totally. But did he lose the other son, the older son, because of that? No. The older son was already lost. And you see that because in the next two paragraphs, the older son says, your money, your son wasted. The older son is unfathered the father and unbrothered the brother. And he is already living in exile. All these years I've worked as what? As a son for you. No. All these years I've worked as a slave for you. And you never even gave me a goat that I could celebrate with my family, my friends. So the older son, he's not lost the older son by welcoming the younger son. He lost the older son many years before. This is another reason why it's really important that we be careful about, is it God's fault that people go away? I mean, is God totally equivalent to the father here? God is in the same position of having the same goal as the father. But he is not in the same position of treatment of the sons. It's really important we're careful with that. Okay, so you move through exclusion again as the older son excludes the father and the brother. And then he says, the father re-sons the older son. Son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. The point is, your younger brother took some of the inheritance, but it was his to take. It was his to take. And the older son is not saying he took his.
You should have known was yours.
Yeah,
Why were you so
exactly.
foolish as to not celebrate with
Exactly.
friends?
Exactly. So we'll come back to it. I want you to wrestle with it. Let's do part 3. There's a whole lot of stuff to wrestle with. But go back through it and use these terms and wrestle with what's going on in the story. Thank you so much.